In this lecture, we'll survey the literary and cultural context for disabled bodies and madness in preparation for discussing H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau, Vincent van Gogh's Self-Portrait with Bandaged Ear, and Mark Quinn's Alison Lapper Pregnant. We've talked before about disgust in this class. Disgust is one of the 6 basic emotions identified as present across diverse cultures. The other primary emotional states include fear, anger, sadness, happiness, and surprise. For a basic definition, we can consider disgust to be our response to something distasteful or offensive. We've talked about the gaping motion in class and how such a distinctive physiological expression of disgust is evolutionary and biological. At its root, disgust is a defensive response, originally associated with the sense of taste, to reject and eject offensive tasting foods or other substances from the mouth and/or stomach. This protects us from ingesting potentially harmful substances, promoting disease and toxin avoidance. Some caveats. Disgust isn't limited to the gaping expression. Faced with a subject of disgust, you might close your eyes, look away, plug your nose, or in the most extreme cases, increase your distance from the offending matter by removing yourself. Disgust is also not just a biological and physiological response, it's a cultural and sociological one. Recall our discussions in class of how disgust differs across cultures, history, and our own life stages. Not all cultures are disgusted by the same things, and we know we are not disgusted by the same things throughout our whole lives. When we think about the foods of different cultures, what may be tantalizing and appealing in one culture may be appalling and incomprehensible in another. A child unafraid of feces or recalcitrant in the face of vegetables is not the hopefully well-adjusted adult who glories in kale salads yet cringes when dogs sniff other dogs' behinds. Moreover, something that never disgusted you at one point in your life may become disgusting at another for purely other physiological reasons. Pregnancy can change a person's preferences and tolerances to certain foods, smells, and tastes. Most importantly, disgust is no longer considered just a biological feeling to protect the body against ingesting potentially harmful substances, but rather plays a role in psychology as well. Disgust not only protects the body, but our unique sense of humanity. This could mean that disgust is a psychological defense to protect one's sense of personal integrity or soul. So, for instance, people perceived as exhibiting immoral or unacceptable behaviors may elicit psychological disgust, but this list is wide and varied. It can include people who act reprehensibly, they've invaded your space, or they do drugs, just as easily as it can include people who have not behaved in any particular way, but simply represent things that people want to avoid. Thus, a conservative person may avoid wearing the sweater offered by his homosexual friend. A victim of rape may be bullied, and acquaintances may feel embarrassed by accidentally bringing attention to a person's illness or disability, for instance, asking a blind person if he or she saw the most recent Marvel movie. It's not necessarily fear of contagion that motivates aversion and avoidance, but rather a desire to avoid any reminders of human imperfection and frailty. I've given us this relatively redundant review of disgust because the concept will serve as key to understanding how madness and disability have been perceived both by those experiencing mental illness and disabilities and those observing these things from the outside. Disgust is an inherent part of the process of socialization, establishing in-groups and out-groups prejudices, be they against certain races, classes, sexualities, ages, genders, the diseased, the disabled, etc., to maintain the integrity of the self. Right now, we see a nationwide uptick in demonstrations of disgust for, and consequently assaults against, Asian Americans as they are being associated with COVID-19. But when disgust becomes self-reflexive or diverted towards the self, a person becomes vulnerable to the onset of emotional disorders. For instance, disgust for food or one's body as overweight and unsightly may lead to anorexia or bulimia. A person who is disgusted with him or herself is typically not only self-loathing, but more prone to depression. We might also observe this kind of self-loathing as manifesting as shame. A person might exercise avoidance strategies in order to cope with particular characteristics about him or herself. So, for instance, a person with a physically apparent illness or disability may avoid mirrors or activities that reveal their bodies, such as going to the beach. They might compensate for their perceived abnormality or lack by overachieving in other areas, by excelling as a community leader, becoming the social group's wit or comedian, or sinking all their time into intellectual endeavors. Reaction formation is another coping mechanism. One may intentionally or unintentionally cover up things deemed unacceptable with excessive demonstrations of the opposing stance. So, for instance, A closeted gay man may be insistently promiscuous with women while angrily protesting gay rights, and a woman dismayed and fatigued by her pregnancy and attendant bodily transformations may rave about the beauties of the pregnant body. Disgust impacts our identity construction, and disability is just as much an identity as anything else, gender, race, class, and so forth. But when any part of our identity, whether it be gender, race, disability, etc., is isolated and heightened in importance above the other parts of our identities, due, for instance, to being a point of social disgust, it becomes a master status and can overwhelm a person's other characteristics. To be clear, the entirety of our identities are comprised of multiple facets. You're never just Muslim or just woman. You're Muslim woman, student, sister, gay, hemophiliac, etc., all at once. Recognizing the connectedness of one's multiple characteristics in race, gender, class, etc., is called intersectionality. For instance, if we were to strip descriptions of one's ethnic or racial appearance from a story, like Toni Morrison does in Recitatif, then those searching to determine a person's race will often rely on interconnected or intersectional assumptions about socioeconomic status, geographic location, chosen profession, and more. When a person is identified with a single identity, the master status takes on exceptional importance in that person's life and often shapes a person's entire life. So, for instance, an obese man, regardless of his other interests and characteristics, may be routinely referred to as simply the fat guy. How this sociological concept coincides with literature is interesting since disabled bodies have traditionally filled the role of villains. Think, for instance, of Shakespeare's hunchbacked Richard III, or any number of fictional characters with missing legs, eyes, or hands that have fulfilled the role of the bad guy. And if disabled bodies are not filling such nefarious roles, they're often forgotten. It's only recently that main characters, or even supporting characters, include those with disabilities of various sorts. Think Geordie LaForge from Star Trek, Artie Abrams from Glee, or Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones. Traditionally, characters who do not fit into cultural meta-narratives are presented as background figures. You're not white or black, but mixed and thus forgotten. You're not heterosexual or homosexual, but bisexual and thus not represented. You're not healthy nor on your deathbed, and so you sit on the sidelines. We can call these characters the in-betweens. Disability studies rethinks the representation of such disabled peoples as traditionally objects of disgust, figures of villainy, or shadows relegated to the margins, and in this way we can begin to ask how disabilities have appeared throughout literature in positive ways, even before we began having a tradition of literature and media with wider representation. Medusa, for instance, the woman whose looks can kill anyone who laughs at her, and sirens, disfigured bodies of brass that nonetheless sing beautifully, are examples of beauty, art, and power found in disabled bodies. Even bodies in pain make works of art that thrive off their somatic sensations and can pinpoint life's greater ironies and poignancies. Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, an early 20th century novella detailing one traveling salesman's innocuous transformation into a large, poster-sized cockroach, is in part inspired by Kafka's own shame and frustration with what he perceived to be his own bodily disfigurement. It was likely that he was anorexic. Kafka is a good example of that kind of artist we find in disability studies who most definitely pathologized himself. He doesn't pretend to be normal or healthy, but instead his suffering gives access to a greater awareness, a brutal knowledge that affects us violently. As he said in a famous 1904 letter to a friend, quote, "I think we ought to read only the kind of books that wound and stab us. If the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow on the head, what are we reading it for? We need the books that affect us, like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, like being banished into forests far from everyone, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us." Medusa, sirens, a man-beetle, each of these are canonical grotesque monsters. A grotesque monster is that which combines incongruous parts into a monstrous whole. So Medusa is a dissonant union of snake and woman. Sirens are often figured as part bird, part woman, and Kafka's protagonist, Gregor Samsa, is a man trapped in a bug's body. Each is a mythologically vivisected and sutured body that traditionally solicits reactions of horror and disgust. But modern readings have demythologized these bodies to reveal how they recall a kind of otherwise inaccessible wonder. When H.G. Wells introduces Prendick to the grotesque bodies of the satyr and ape-man in the island of Dr. Moreau, it's a throwback to T.H. Huxley's introduction for his book Man's Place in Nature, published in 1863, which begins by lauding the dreams of the ancients, the classical memories, like Ovid's Metamorphosis. Huxley, Wells, and these other grotesque bodies all do the same thing. They champion imagination. They refuse the intellectual necrosis of human knowledge that may result from anatomizing knowledge and reducing the human experience to its scientific diagnoses and disorders. As the late 20th century Welsh national poet Gwyneth Lewis says, quote, "Every disease is a work of art, if you play it rightly." Unquote. Madness in culture and literature likewise has been a source of creativity, of poetic genius. Sometimes it's the hallucinations. William Blake, one of the original British romantics of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, reportedly experienced visions as young as 4 years old. He reifies his hallucinations as prophetic visions and creates his own mythology for comprehending the universe. Here we see Urizen, his embodiment for reason. Sometimes it's the drugs. Thomas De Quincey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were both opium addicts in the early 19th century and accessed wild and thrilling ethereal and sublime scenes while under the influence. De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater chronicles his life experiences becoming addicted and illuminating in ways inaccessible to physicians at the time the effects and consequences of the drug. On the right side, Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan is a famous poem fragment, incomplete because it's based on an interrupted opium-induced dream. In it, Coleridge describes a rapturous image of Khan's pleasure dome situated at the edge of an erupting fountain. Even when something mad appears to have a legitimate scientific explanation, we can still see this intense, universal preoccupation across Western art and culture for rooting into the depths of our minds. Here is Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare, commonly featured on the cover of Frankenstein novels, possibly because Fuseli was one of Mary Shelley's mother's lovers, but also because the painting captures the mad genius of a romantic poet. It's been argued that the painting is a representation of sleep paralysis. So let's look at it this way. In the painting, an incubus, or male demon who sexually exploits women, crouches on top a recumbent woman while a horse's head breaks through the curtained background and gazes on. Unlike paintings of the earlier century during the Enlightenment, this painting is dark, perhaps representing the futility of light to penetrate the darker realms of our minds. The position of the woman, reclined with one arm up and head tilted, is an allusion to the classical painting Sleeping Ariadne, but again Fuseli's Nightmare presents no rational body, but an irrational dream world full of intense feeling and sensuality. The mare, or nightmare, indicates the sleep state, while the imp suggests the titillation of descending into a dream state, where not order, but desire reigns. Here the mind is pointedly stronger than the body. The demon has rendered the woman supine and vulnerable, stomach and neck exposed. The mare, then, is not just any nightmare, but Mara, an evil spirit of Germanic folklore that tortures and suffocates humans while they sleep. This is a mythological figuring of sleep paralysis. As Dr. Samuel Johnson once described it, the nightmare spirit is a, quote, morbid oppression in the night resembling the pressure of weight upon the breast. End quote. This painting unsettled viewers who believed that art should only show the light and make sense of the world. But sometimes, even if we have the scientific explanation for things, our experiences, our losses, our hopes, our stupid jokes, our friends, and so forth don't make sense. And we kind of don't want them to. Such is the revelation of madness as genius. The mad poet and the mad scientist are archetypes consequent of social expectations for order rather than disorder. Healthy things are ordered. This mantra can be used to provide a sweeping generalization about Western medicine. Whether we're talking about equilibrium in the humoral model, after the foundation of pharmaceuticals, or with the establishment of homeopathic medicine, generally ordered means good. And we might think this too on some subconscious, if not conscious level. Your body organizes what comes in and what goes out, swarming things like bacteria and viruses that don't belong, while carefully storing or building with the proteins that do belong. It is once your body stops organizing itself that death and decay approach. After all, the concept of a heat death in the universe is based not on the disappearance of all matter, but the inability to use any of it, a state of entropy. Like a room all askew, you would never be able to find anything or get anything done. This may appear to be a highly metaphorical way of thinking about health, but in the 19th century, these concepts of equilibrium informed theories of bodily economy. They did not stop at saying the mind is disordered, but rather went further to say that great irritation of one's mental state, like constantly scratching on a violin string, could overexcite one's physiology and lead to headaches, brain fever, consumption, anorexia, and other bodily disorders. This connection between the mind and body's excitability is called neurasthenia. This idea of health as order captures our expectations of society as well. In an essentially Hobbesian way, order means establishing boundaries. There's a leader and followers, a group dedicated to making law, and a group assigned to enforcing the law. Social and professional respect is hierarchical. Family structure designates who makes the decisions and who doesn't, and so forth. Imagine a world, though, that was more equal, less borders, no rules. This would be the very definition of anarchy. But somewhere between totalitarian order and anarchical disorder, we exist in a constant struggle for equality, disorder, yet protection, order. Thus, the archetypal mad woman is shoved into the attic at best or asylum at worst to compartmentalize and isolate the danger she poses. Order is political, social, geographic, and psychological. Art and literature generally conceptualize the mind with the same organizing principle. The ordered mind is rational, while the disordered mind is mad. As a result, patient narratives by artists that give accounts of mental illness often seek a kind of recovery or healthy self-actualization through recollection, a visceral remembering or reattaching of parts perceived as having been previously lost or never attained. It's kind of like reattaching limbs and prosthetics to make the body whole again, thus the word remembering. In Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, her depressive state motivates her association of the act of writing with realizing her rights and experiences as a woman. This means using the act of writing to recall and stitch back together what she perceives to be fragmentalized parts of her psyche and past. She recalls the self to heal. In contrast, the inability to reframe and reorder one's experiences in art and literature may be generally understood as a collapse into psychosis. These kinds of illnesses and disorders also tend to elicit disgust and avoidance from surrounding figures. The idea is that ill minds, just like ill bodies, threaten a kind of contagionism, and empathy, the erasure of physical and emotional boundaries, threatens exposure of oneself to illness. There's even a 19th century word to capture this idea. In 1875, Sir James Paget coined the word neuromimesis to indicate a kind of nervous mimicry, a disease of the imagination that causes one to mimic diseases upon observing them. It's a kind of pathological imitation that informs our understanding of some late 19th century theories concerning the suggestibility of insanity, again underscoring the history of mental illness as anchored in our initial understandings of feeling and imagination. Some last notes. Disorder can be good. Just a little bit ago, we suggested that disorder is associated with empathy, breaking down boundaries. The archetype of the self-sacrificial scientist, of which Marie Curie is an example, she died due to massive amounts of exposure to radiation as she studied radioactivity, gives too much of him or herself to society. Obversely, order can also be pathological. We said earlier that too much order in society may result in totalitarianism. Imagine, for instance, a society that said all the black people had to live in this neighborhood, while all the white people live in this other neighborhood. It's organized, but it's certainly not healthy. Monomaniacs in literature and art are these embodiments of extreme order. They represent the defensible self, a dream that our borders, our bodies, and our known knowledges must be protected from alien invasion or contagions and the unknown. They fixate on one thing and protect that one thing to the death. And because of this, just as we associate disorder with empathy, we might associate order with not just disgust, but selfishness. The monomaniacal scientist who becomes implicated with body snatchers kills to ruthlessly serve his research interests. Those willing to operate without anesthesia for more accurate observations of bodily processes further a cold-blooded science. The association between madness and ego is reciprocal as well. In art and literature, we have numerous figures whose inflated egos are so all-consuming that their single-mindedness is what qualifies them for madness. Consider, for instance, Shakespeare's Hamlet or Herman Melville's Captain Ahab. These are figures who pit themselves against the world. Ironically, even though they are typically perceived as destructive, their monomania still relies on a sense of order. How crazy is that?